Hello and welcome to our second video covering the basic skills you need to know for playing the marimba or the xylophone. When we talk about the percussion keyboard instruments, or most people just say keyboard, we actually have 5 keyboard instruments. We have the marimba, which you see here, the xylophone, the glockenspiel, the vibraphone, and the chimes, the tubular bells. All the instruments have some of their own unique skills. But in general, when we're looking at the stroke and scales and arpeggios, once you learn one of them, then you should be able to move on to the next one fairly successfully. The focus of this video is going to be breaking down the 4 universal percussion principles needed on almost all of the keyboards. And as I've mentioned, those 4 skills are the grip, the lever, the playing spot, and the stroke. And again, my philosophy when I'm coming to either the snare drum or the marimba, the drum set, the timpani, I like to identify those 4 issues before I play the instrument. And then it really lets me know how I get the sound I want out of each instrument. So let's start with the grip. I basically hold the keyboard instrument the same as I hold the snare drum. I hold the keyboard mallet the same as I hold the snare drum stick with a fulcrum. And I like to keep my fingers close, if not even touching the stick. So I'm going to do the same thing here. If we compare our grips between the snare drum grip and the keyboard grip, they would look identical. Now, the weight of the keyboard mallet does cause us to make one adjustment. My snare drum gripping point is generally the back third of the stick. I break the stick into 3 equal parts, and that's where I usually place my fulcrum. Of course, we can place the fulcrum in a number of different spots, but for beginning purposes, I generally put it right there. But the heaviness, the heavy ball, the round ball on the keyboard instrument generally causes us to choke up a little bit on this stick than it would over this one. So you may notice you're not actually holding a third. So if I broke this stick into 3 equal parts, I would be there, but that to me feels like a lot of weight, so I might choke up a little bit on the stick. Some other issue we tend to run into with keyboard mallets, in general, marimba mallets, like you would have here, are longer than xylophone and glockenspiel mallets. So you can see there easily 2 inches, maybe a little bit more, between the xylophone mallet. This is just a soft mallet that works on the marimba as well, versus the yarn mallet. So the mallets have become longer to enable 4 mallet playing, and that's why almost all of the wrapped mallets are pretty long. So we just have to be careful. You may have a lot of the rattan sticking out back here, and you want to be careful that that doesn't strike the instrument. So there's our grip. Again, a nice fulcrum between the index finger and the thumb. And I like to keep these fingers close to the stick, but definitely not squeezing. And that's the hand position I'm thinking about here. If you're doing this with me, so good stance here, feet are shoulder width. I bring my hands up with flat wrist, moving them like this. I'll close my fingers. Now notice what I'm being careful not to do is to turn my wrist either this way, outward, or inward. I want a nice straight wrist coming right off of the forearm there, and that's where I hold the stick. I try to use this grip on a lot of as many instruments as possible. So there's our grip ideas. Let's talk a little bit about lever. We have 3 levers. You've noticed in some of the accessory videos and some of the other work that we're doing together, we have 3 levers. We have the arm for slow, heavier playing. We have the wrist for quicker legato playing, and then we can use the fingers for double bounces and some things like that. And I think it's important to always consider that there are 3 levers that are available and decide which levers are appropriate on each and every instrument. That said, I think the keyboard instrument is primarily used with the wrist. Lot of wrist motion. Now, what I think you should be careful of, when I say mostly wrist, that doesn't mean all wrist and lock your arms and get really stiff and do this. You should relax, always stay relaxed, keep the arms relaxed, and even using a wrist motion, the arms will move just a little, and I think they should move just a little bit. Even when I'm over on the snare drum and if I'm playing a mostly wrist pattern, my arms, there's some residual movement when I move the wrist that the arm is going to kind of wiggle back and forth. And so don't let that be a problem. It's actually very hard to fully isolate one lever from the other. So a mostly wrist lever. Now the playing spot is a little difficult. And as I've mentioned in the first video, you've already hopefully developed the control of knowing exactly where your sticks are going to strike your instrument. So I think it's good when you start on the snare drum or wherever you started your percussion studies that you really were aiming for a very small playing spot. So if you can see my drum pad here, the drum pad, that playing area has worn down a little bit, but in general, everything is happening within a 2-inch circle, right about there. And so we want to make sure that while we're playing simple warm-up exercises and things, that we have a very small playing spot, because now we come to an instrument whose playing spot is at the most down here, 2 inches wide, up there, 1 inch wide, and a glockenspiel bars can get very small. So we really have got to have developed good control. Once you've developed good control, there's a few different playing spots on the keyboard that we need to discuss. I tend to break them down between the naturals and the accidentals. On the naturals, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, I will always play right in the center of the bar. Now I'm going to play that again, but I'm going to purposefully miss the playing spot, and let's see if you can hear the difference. Or better yet, when both sticks don't hit exactly in the same spot, you get two different sounds, right? So you can do this at home even if you don't have a keyboard. Take a pair of keyboard mallets and just try to play in exactly the same spot. Just like that. Now that might be a little different than some other people have shown you how to play the keyboard. I think a lot of people actually play the keyboard with one stick slightly in front of the other. So they would do this. Or maybe this. Where now my right hand is a little in front, or the left hand could be a little in front. Depends which way you're going on the keyboard. Perfectly acceptable way to play, but you have to keep the sticks very close to each other. And if they get this far apart, then you get two different sounds. I like to play with both of my sticks exactly in the same spot. We'll talk about stroke in a second. If you lift that stick out of the way, then you have full access to the same spot. So on the naturals, I always play in the center. On the accidentals, we have two options. We can play right in the center, just like the naturals, but that's a long way to reach. And when you're playing faster passages, you simply won't get there. So we have a secondary playing spot, and that's right on the very edge of the keyboard. So if I were to play a scale just on the accidentals and on the edge of the bar, we would have this. Now, if I play it in the center, it sounds a little better. Than this. You can hear there's a little bit more resonance in the center than there is on the edge. We'll break down scales in a later video, but if I'm going to play a chromatic scale, for instance, and I try to play everything in the centers, that's a long way to reach, as opposed to center on the naturals, edges of the accidentals. It's much easier to play. So there are scenarios which you have to play on the very edge of the bar. And I actually suggest that all beginning keyboard players just start on the edges of the accidentals and the centers of the naturals. And here's the main reason. It's a very small playing spot that you have to learn to manage. You actually have a little bit more room for error, if you would, when you go to the center. So here's the center of the F sharp. Now here's a little off center. Doesn't sound terribly bad, but I have 2 or 3 inches to work with, and I think that's a little easier to manage. Learning to play on the very edge is very important. So here's the edge of the F sharp. Now if I move just a little towards the center, I get what we call the node of the bar, where there's very little resonance at all. So I think it's best to perfect the art of playing on the edge of the bars first before you reach for the centers. So again, centers of the naturals, edges of the accidentals. So we've covered grip, we've covered lever, and playing spot. Now let's just talk briefly about stroke, the last of the percussion principles, universal percussion principles. We have 3 strokes. All instruments require us to play all of those strokes. Full strokes, downstrokes, and upstrokes. It's not just a snare drum thing, or just a drum set thing, or just a timpani thing, or just a marimba thing. You have to have all of those strokes ready to go and know how to use the right one at the right time. And I think it's an important skill to learn on the snare drum. And one of the examples I like to give is this. I'll play full strokes, change it to downstrokes, and change it to upstrokes. And let's listen to the difference. There's the downstroke, and there's the upstroke. If I'm going to do that with both hands, full strokes, downstrokes, did you hear how it got harsher? Upstrokes, the lightest sound of the 3. So primarily we want to be able to control our sound, have absolute sonic control by changing our strokes. Now when we come to the marimba, in general we're going to want to use a full stroke for the sound. Now that's a stroke I'll use on the snare drum all the time. But the main difference here is that the drum pad, the drum, naturally provides rebound. So you can see when I barely hold the stick flies back up off the head. The head has a lot of rebound in it, but the keyboard has very little rebound. As in none at all. But I have to have the same stroke, so now I have to lift the mallet immediately after impact. And so I think a great thing to practice is full strokes on a drum pad, and then full strokes on the marimba. You can even take your marimba mallet to the drum pad. It won't hurt it at all to play. You want to have the exact same full stroke that you have on the drum where rebound helps. Here you just have to kind of create your own rebound. So just a quick review on the 4 universal percussion principles for the keyboard. We've covered grip, like the snare drum grip, a little further up on the stick. We talked about the lever, which is mostly a wrist motion. We talked about the playing spot, centers of the accidentals, centers of the naturals, edges of the accidentals, and then finally the stroke, the full stroke, for full, rich, warm legato sound.